Hello everyone, my name is Savannah Kepley and I am a middle school language arts teacher, and I am coming to you from my car because my daughter is at dance always. And so I decided while I'm sitting in the car and it's April, so it means it's poetry month, that I would share with you some of my favorite poetry activities. Not some of them, I'm going to share one with you. One poetry activity that my students love. So what happened when I first did this is I went to a workshop on how to do it, and when I went to the workshop I was like, this is great, let me try it with my class. And when I tried it with my class, they were like, that's amazing, we had so much fun, when can we do this again? And I said, you do realize you just sat around and talked about poetry and analyzed it and discussed it and connected it to your life? And they're like, yeah, it was great. I was like, all right, we'll do some more. So what was this magical activity? It was poetry seminars. And so if you've never done a seminar or a Socratic seminar, it's kind of like that. Basically, at least how I was taught how to do it, is the students sit in a circle and then you pose questions or throw out questions, and then they discuss the questions with each other. And it's really heartwarming, I think is a great word to use here. It's really heartwarming to see them sit and talk about how the poems connect to their life, and then what they think about situations going on in our culture today. It's really amazing to watch. And so even people will probably think, hey, you could probably only do this with your advanced or gifted classes. I actually do this with all of my classes because they all have something to say, and some may need a little bit more guidance with the understanding of the poetry, but they really enjoy sitting around and talking about it. So if you want to try some of this magic with your students, let me give you about 10 tips, 10 steps that you can follow to run a successful poetry seminar. So all your students can do it and they are all engaged in the process. And at the end, they're going to be like, that was so much fun. When can we do it again? So step one is that you do an author study. So you have to pick a poem, and then obviously you have to pick a poem, and then whatever poem you pick, we have to study the author. Because a lot of times with poetry, the author brings a lot of their life into it, or at least it's influenced by their life. So I think for students to understand and grasp a poem, it's super important for them to have an understanding of the author. So I spent about 1 or 2 days with my author study. So what I do is I put up this Google slide that is interactive, and they can click on the different pieces. Like, for example, there's a movie about an author, or there's some articles about an author, or there's a collection of images that relate to the author. So they look through all of this, and then they fill out this investigation sheet that looks like this. And what they are doing is they are gathering information, right, about their accomplishments, education, what they're famous for, common themes and messages, along with birth, death, family information, because all of that helps create an understanding of the poem. So going through this or spending time with this helps students really grasp the poem and where the author is coming from. Now, if you have some advanced classes or some classes that need a little extra challenge, I encourage you to take the information that they learned in the author investigation and have them write an obituary or tribute for the author based on the information that they learned. I actually did this as a pop challenge with one of my classes. So what I did is I gave them the Google slide that had where they can click on it. I gave them the investigation sheet and the obituary instruction sheet, and I said, all right, you have all class period to make this happen. And they did. They had so much fun, like learning about the author, filling out their investigation sheet, and then learning about how to write an obituary. Anytime you call something a challenge, I found, like, especially in middle school, they're like, bring it on, let's do it, it's fun. So I call it a pop challenge because they didn't know it was coming, and it just added a little bit of an element of excitement to it. So after I do the author study, we take time to read the poem. But before we read the poem, I show them some vocabulary slides. Now, I know with poetry, there's a lot of words that we don't know. And my southern accent, especially when there's pollen in the air, my voice is kind of crazy. I have to make sure I'm pronouncing these words correctly. So I show them Google slides, and I, again, look at the pronunciations ahead of time to make sure I'm doing it right. And because sometimes I don't know the 18th century words. I just don't know. So I look on Google pronunciation, I make sure I'm saying it right, they say it with me, then we use it in a sentence, and I connect it usually with a GIF. GIF? I never know what to say there. But anyway, it looks like this. So we have the word, we have the definition, we have the GIF, whatever, don't come at me, and then we also have an example sentence. And so I make sure my students know these words and how to say them before we start reading the poem, because that will get them a little bit more comfortable with the poem when they see these fancy words inside of it. After I do vocabulary, it's time for step 3, which is just giving them time to actually read the poem. Now, for me, I can't send it home with them and tell them to do it for homework. We actually have to spend some serious class time doing this, just because with the type of students I teach, if I send it home, maybe 10 would do it and the other 20 wouldn't. So it would just be, you know, a waste of time for those 10, because then we would have to spend time doing it in class anyway, blah 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 blah. So we just do it in class. Now, I have found that my students need a lot of structure and instructions and expectations from me when reading poetry, because at the beginning I did not give them structure and expectations. I was like, all right, read it, and then they would read it and they would not ingest it, right? They wouldn't understand what they read. And so I really encourage active reading in my classroom. Anytime we're reading for the purpose of analyzing a text, we always have our pencil in our hand, because we're doing those annotations, or I call them jots sometimes in my classroom. And so we're always doing that because we're always thinking about what we read, right? And so, because we want to talk about it, and we really need to understand it in order to talk about it. So I expect my students to do annotations, because for 7th grade with difficult poetry, we're gonna have to tackle that poetry, right? We can't just like look at it. We have to like write about it, think about it. And annotations are a great way to think about what we're reading. It kind of pauses us, right? It makes us slow down a little bit while we're reading. So anyway, get a little off on a rant on my annotations, right? I think they're just super important for middle school students. So I tell them with this poem, or with poetry, for each stanza, we're going to stop and we're going to think, what is my reaction to this? What questions do I have from reading this? What is the author trying to say? And like, what images can I create in my head based on what the author is writing here? And so for each stanza, we do those 4 annotations. And on top of that, we look for figurative language and try to figure out like any words repeated and that kind of thing, so we can think about what the author is trying to get across. Now, if your students have never done this, I encourage, before you start a poetry seminar, to check out my section on how to annotate poetry and practice that with a couple of different poems before you jump in and do it with a poetry seminar, because it would just be a lot of like learning in one little bit. You want that to already have that skill for this activity. So anyway, so we read the poem and we annotate the poem. So really by doing that, we have a great understanding of what's happening. Now, you could have your students do this with a partner and independently, because no one says that you only can read a poem one time, right? You can read it the first time with a partner and do 2 annotations, and then the second time read it independently and do the other 2 annotations. So that way you're really coming at it from a couple of different perspectives. So after we read the poem, now it's time, now that we have laid the groundwork, now it's time to actually start our seminar. So that leads us to step number 4, which is set up your classroom. Now, when I'm doing seminars a lot, I actually have trained my students on how to do this. So I'm like, all right, let's set up for a seminar, and we have practiced moving the tables to the perimeter of the room, and the students sit in the, like, they bring their chairs to the middle and we sit in a circle. Now, if you have not trained your students on how to do that yet, that's okay. You can have the room set up for them. Just move your tables around and put your chairs in a circle. Alternatively, check out the Media Center. That's a great place to do seminars as well, because they often have bigger spaces and it makes them feel a little bit more, you know, collegiate, I guess the word is, to go into a media center and have discussions about poetry, right? They love it. So I encourage you to check out your media center if that's available for you. So now that your classroom is set up, it's time for step 5, which is set a classroom goal. So by now we have looked at an author study, and y'all, this is not all in one day. This is over the course of like several days, like 1 or 2 days on the author study, like 1 whole day learning vocabulary and reading the poem, and then your 3rd day is when you would actually do the seminar. So they come into the 3rd day already have read the poem, and they know we're going to talk about it. We're going to do some discussions. It's going to be super exciting. So they come in that 3rd day, and we're like, all right, y'all, we're gonna set a classroom goal. Like there has to be a purpose for why we're doing this. So typically my classroom goal goes along with whatever standard that I'm applying this poem to. So like if you're just beginning poetry, it could be like, hey y'all, our classroom goal is to understand this complicated and complex poem, like to understand what the author was trying to say here. Or you could do something like to understand how the theme was developed through the course of the poem, or how the author created the mood throughout the poem. I don't know, whatever your standard is, that will be your classroom goal. So before we start, I'm like, y'all, this is what we're aiming for. This is why we are doing this whole poetry seminar. After we set our classroom goal, on their poem paper, I have them flip it over to the back. I'm like, okay, I want you to set a personal goal. So I always have students who want to dominate conversation, like they want to speak all the time, like they want to answer every question. And then I have those students who don't want to say anything. So I'm like, y'all, let's think about this. Let's think about how you are in a classroom setting. And I want you to participate. So let's set a classroom goal that's going to encourage your participation. So it might be to speak at least 2 times during the class, or, you know, maybe only speak 5 times and kind of hold back and let others have part of the conversation. Try not to dominate everything. So people come up with their own classroom goals, and that encourages everybody to participate. So if we set the standard ahead of time, set the expectation ahead of time, we're more likely to participate during the seminar. So after we set our classroom goal and personal goal, it's time to start like really interacting with the poem. And because this is the 3rd day, like yesterday we read and analyzed the poem, and today we're coming back to it. So I want to get them familiar with the poem again. So what I have them do is step number 7 is set up the poem. So what that means is I just want you to number the stanzas in each line, because what that is going to do when we are having discussions, we can refer back to the poem. Like for example, in stanza 2, lines 6 and 7, the author said blah blah blah, and that way we have great reference points, so we can all go back to the text and find whatever the student is talking about and what they're referring to. So we set up the poem, and then comes one of the most important things that you can do to help make your classroom seminar engaging and not what might be a little awkward, but engaging and a safe space for everybody to speak. And that is to create your initial talking point. So after we set up the poem, I'm like, all right, y'all, let's look back over our poem. And then what I want you to do is underline 1, or if they go together, 2 lines that you find are really impactful, important, or it could just be something that you like that the author said. So I give them a couple minutes to find these 2 lines or line and underline it. And we're all in a circle. I'm like, all right, y'all, we are all going to share what we think is the most important or impactful, or just a line that we like. And I start with someone that I know is going to be confident, so I ask for volunteers, and I usually pick someone I know is going to like really bring it, like you know who those people are in your class. So I pick that person, and they go first, and they say, my most impactful line, I thought, was stanza 2, lines 6 and 7. And then they actually read those 2 lines out loud. And I'm like, great. And then we go around the circle. And everybody has to share, even if someone else already, quote, stole your line, right? So even that quiet person who doesn't want to talk and might be like, so-and-so took my line. Well, that's great. I want you to read it also. I want you to share your voice. And so doing this gets everybody used to speaking while you're in the circle. So it kind of breaks the ice a little bit. And you're like, all right, now that we get back to the beginning, we are good to go. And so that leads you to step number 9, which is discuss. So you need to, ahead of time, create some open-ended questions. I usually create about 10 open-ended questions. And this can be anything like, who is this? Is this poem still relevant today? Can the theme of this poem be applied to our lives? Do you agree with the author is saying? You know, generic questions like that that can be discussed with each other. Now, while we are discussing, it's important that the students talk to each other and not you, because they are having a seminar. They're having a discussion. They're not answering yes or no questions and explaining their thoughts to you, right? We want them bouncing off each other. So prior to this, I give them some examples. Let's say Liam says something that you like, and you can be like, I agree with you, Liam. In addition to that, blah, 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 blah. Or encourage them that it's okay for people to have different opinions than them. And it's okay not to agree with somebody, but we need to do it respectfully. So you could say, Liam, I hear what you're saying, and I understand why you're saying that, but let me tell you where I'm coming from. So that kind of thing. Because sometimes these can get a little heated. Like middle schoolers have opinions and they want to share them. And in these poetry seminars, they do share them. So for example, one of the poetry seminars that we do is We Wear the Mask by Paul Laurence Dunbar. And it's about, is wearing a mask a good thing? Like, one of the questions I asked, is it ever a good thing to wear a mask, you know? And so they really have some great ideas and some opinions about trying to hide who they are and why they do that. And then other people have opinions like, no, you should be who you are, own it, right? And so it gets a little, not heated, but everybody has their opinion. And so encourage active listening, encourage proper etiquette, like everybody has an opinion, and that's okay. And you don't have to agree with everybody, but we're going to be respectful. And I say that before we start our seminar, so they know what my expectation for etiquette is. And also, I always encourage students to go back to the text and tell me why they think that, or why they have that opinion. I think the hardest part is getting students to talk to each other and not you. All right, so that leads us to our last step, which is written response. Step number 10. So what I have students do is, after our discussion, wait, let me get back to the discussion real quick. So when you see that students are kind of waning and people aren't popping in anymore to contribute to the discussion, that's when you ask your next question. So again, having about 10 questions ready to go is a great way to do it. And if you are worried about your students just talking to you, you can cut out the questions and give them to random students in the circle and say, okay, Megan, it's your turn. Open the little card that I gave you and read the question. And so that way they're asking the questions to each other and not you. All right, step number 10 is written discussion, a written response. After we talk about the poem, I give them an opportunity to write about it. And my written prompts, I usually give them about 3, and they have to pick one, and they connect the poem to their life and also to whatever our class goal was. So if it was how the theme was developed throughout the poem, I would put the question out there like, what is the theme? How is it developed? And is this theme relevant today? Or is this theme relevant to your life? And so when they respond to these questions, they have to reference the poem and reference their life in order to write their response. And that's it. that is how you create an engaging discussion with poetry, and students love it. I promise. They're just gonna love it, and you are gonna be like the rock star teacher. And when your admin walks by, they're gonna be like, look at them in there talking about poetry. It's gonna be beautiful. You're gonna love it. Now, I do have some things to help you get started on this. On Teachers Pay Teachers, I do have one of my seminars, which is the Paul Lawrence Dunbar seminar on We Wear the Mask. So that's available. If you are an ELA Unlimited member, I have all of my annotation guides. There's like 6 poems on there with annotation guides and teacher notes. And then I also have the seminar on there. If you're like, what is ELA Unlimited? Let me tell you, it is the best site for middle school language arts teachers, because you can go on there, download what you need when you need it, minimal prep. You can use it tomorrow in your classroom, or today if you're watching this in the morning or something. So it's all right there ready for you to download and use. Go check it out. All the links are in the description below, and I hope your students loved doing this, and I hope you have fun teaching poetry with this poetry seminar. Until next time, bye.